We thank the worship team one more time for leading us tonight. Thank you so much. Well, it is great to be here. As you can see on the screen, we are in a psalm called Psalm 23, and if you didn't know that by now, hopefully you know it now. This is the fourth week in a sermon series that we're calling Psalm 23. It's really creative. And we are in verse 4 because it's week 4. So we're preaching through one verse a week for 6 weeks, and so that means we have 2 more weeks after this to close out this series that we're in. So Psalm 23, verse 4, if you have a Bible, you could open it up. Psalms is right in the middle of your Bible to some extent. And if you want to track along with us tonight, we're just going to be in verse 4. And that's where we're going to be camping for the whole sermon. So how many of you have watched The Lion King before? It's a nice transition right there. So hopefully you've seen it. Okay, how many of you have seen like the original Lion King? Raise your hand for that one. I prefer the original. If you like the new one, that's great for you. And I hope you enjoy it for the rest of your life. The Lion King has a special place in my heart because it was released the very year that I was born, so 1994. You can do the math on how old I am if you want. It's 30 years ago this year. It's an enjoyable movie. So this movie starts out, hopefully you're aware, with Simba, the new lion cub being born, and Rafiki, this monkey, he holds him up to the whole community of animals that are all here gathered to see like the birth of this new king, essentially, that's going to take the throne after Mufasa, the current king, is done reigning and passes away. So, great movie, iconic scene. It starts out with that like, Singanya, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, it's all there. I won't sing the rest of it. No. Okay, moving on. So, Simba, little lion cub, he grows up a little bit, and Mufasa, his father, shows him what they call the Pride Lands, the land that is owned and governed by the lions. And he says, look, this is my kingdom. And he warns his son, Simba. He says, look, we control and we rule over this whole kingdom. But there's this portion over here that's called, it's this dark, shadowy portion of the land. And Simba says, what's that over there? And Mufasa says, no, we don't go over there. It's a dangerous place. It's this place that they call the Elephant Graveyard. It's a dark and shadowy place. It's not a good place. Simba, in his own arrogance and pride, gets this idea in his mind of, I want to go see what's over there. And so he takes a journey over to the Elephant Graveyard, and he takes his friend Nala with him, and they, against his father's wishes and guidance, gets himself into this situation where they're in a lot of trouble. They wander into the Elephant Graveyard, and lo and behold, as his dad warned him, there is danger there that he hadn't anticipated, and they get themselves into this situation that they actually now can't get themselves out of because, and again, this is like a kid's story, but they get themselves into this situation where these hyenas jump out at them, 3 of them, and they are prepared and ready to eat Simba and Nala. The story is about to end. So they're backed into a corner. They're in this terrible situation that they had no idea was going to get so dark so quickly. And us, as children, as we watch this, we're thinking, wow, this gets like really morbid. I thought this was going to be a nice, happy story about Simba becoming king, but it's about to end so quickly. It's a dangerous place that they get themselves into. So as we read our text today, I want you to think about that scene that is being set in The Lion King. So Simba, he's excited about the future, but he gets himself into this sticky situation that is almost assuredly going to end in him being eaten and his friends that he brought along with him. So as we jump into our text, Psalm 23, verse 4 reads as follows. We'll just start with the first line. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So if you look at the screen also, you'll notice that there's a picture of the Elephant Graveyard. It's this valley of bones and death, and it's dark and dreary, unlike the Pride Lands of the land that the lions own, which is sunny and beautiful and lush and green. This is the transition in the psalm when instead of the shepherd, who we started with, leading his sheep into green pastures and into still waters and all of these good things, verse 4 takes this weird turn where it says, even though now I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, ... We'll get to the rest of the verse as we continue tonight, but we're starting here, and I want to unpack this image because it's an important one, and for your sake, this is also one of the most iconic psalms in the entire Bible. It's one of the most iconic chapters and verses in the entire Bible. This image of the valley of the shadow of death is an important one, and I hope we can understand it better tonight. So first of all, what I want to read you is just a short clip from this commentary that I was reading to help you understand what is the valley of the shadow of death and what does this actually look like in the real world. So here we go. As shepherds would lead their flocks in search of grass and water, they would sometimes need to pass into and through deep, rugged ravines. So think about that when you're thinking about the valley of the shadow of death. These are like dry stream beds cut through the hills by the winter rain. The air at the bottom of these deep ravines is thick and heavy with the heat of the day, so it's hot down there. Like canyons, they are covered in dark shadows as the cliff walls block out the sun. The whole flock had to struggle over rocks and boulders and up the sides of the canyon to get through this if the shepherd's leading them through it here. If the flock is caught in one of these places during a storm, a flash flood could sweep them away all to their deaths. So there's danger here. And to make it worse, wild animals also live in these cracks and shadows inside the ravine, ready to tear any unsuspecting sheep to shreds if caught alone. Okay, so here's some context. We've followed the shepherd as he's led us to calm, green pastures and calm waters, and he restores us, and he helps us walk in righteousness. But now we get to this point where it's like the valley of the shadow of death. And so we see there's danger here. So for the shepherd to his sheep, he's leading them into this place where it's hot. There could be danger from flooding, danger from the darkness, the rocky and crumbly terrain, and then even wild animals coming out and potentially snatching one of these sheep and devouring it. It's not a safe place. But I want you to notice this as we read this. The valley of the shadow of death is not a place that the sheep has wandered off into. So there's some verses in the New Testament which explain that there's this famous story of a lost sheep, and he gets himself stuck, and so a shepherd goes and he finds him and he brings him back to the fold. That's not what's going on here. There's not like a verse 3.5 before this that said the sheep wandered off and it walked through the valley of the shadow of death. It doesn't say that. It says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the verse continues on to say that the sheep are with their shepherd in this moment. We are led into this valley by the shepherd. So that's a very important clarification that we need to see as we read this. And you might ask, well, why would the shepherd lead his sheep into such a dark and dangerous place where there's so many things that could go wrong? And I think that's a pretty valid question to be asking. But this is the best way I can explain it. If I want to go home tonight, I have to drive on I-90 to get home, right? And you might ask, well, why would you have to take I-90? Well, I live on Mercer Island, and there's one way. Mercer Island's great, yes. But if I go home every day, there's traffic, and oftentimes, someone important's in town, like the president, or you might think Taylor Swift's really important, and that causes traffic to get to Seattle, and I have to drive on that road to get to Mercer Island. So I have to sit in that traffic, and I don't have a choice. The shepherd, similarly, might need to lead his sheep into a place where they need to go, and this is the only option. In reality, if we look back historically and say, well, why would a shepherd do this? Maybe there's green pastures or various things that the shepherd needs to take his sheep to help sustain their life and help guide them in a way that they can't find on their own. The sheep wouldn't want to wander into this place on his or her own. But the shepherd knows, I need to take my sheep here, and he's going to guide them through this hard place because he knows what's on the other side, and he knows that it's important to get there. What is the shadow of death anyways? And I think I want to at least explain this briefly, because if I read a verse like this, I think, okay, the valley of the shadow of death, what does the shadow of death even mean? It could be confusing, but I want you to focus in on this. It's not the valley of death. This is not the valley of death. It's not a valley where you come to die. This is just the valley of the shadow of death, and that's important because of this. Here's a quote from Matthew Henry, who's a commentator on this. He says this, "It is but the shadow of death. There is no substantial evil in it. The shadow of a serpent will not sting you, nor will the shadow of a sword kill you." And so, you see here, even, he's focusing on the idea that the shadow of death is not something that is providing any source of imminent danger to these sheep. There is terror and there is fear here, but it's just a shadow. It's not death itself. This is something that we should see as we read this. Also note this, the verse says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So the sheep are not frantically running. This isn't like a stampede because they're getting chased by anything. They're not frantic. There's nothing causing them to be terrified to the point of needing to run through here or rush or anything. They are walking through the valley of the shadow of death. It's almost a peaceful image that we see. While there's terror all around, we're walking. And then second thing, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we're not camping out in the shadow of death. The sheep are not sitting here and they're not, the destination is not the shadow of death. The destination is what's on the other side. We're walking through this place. It's not designed for us to be here long because it's just temporary. So notice those things as we read this verse. Similarly to the sheep, what I want you to see is that we have troubles in life. So this represents something that we experience. This isn't just for us to learn about sheep tonight. Maybe that's what you were thinking. Like, wow, this is a great lesson on sheep. I love sheep so much. But what's really going on is this is a metaphor for us to look at our own lives and see how we are like those sheep, and we are like, and God is like the shepherd, that we are following through this valley. And there's any number of things that you could replace for the valley of the shadow of death and say, well, what does that actually look like in my life today? Or what is that going to look like in my life in the future? And I want to give you some things, hopefully, to make that tangible for you tonight. One of those things could be, first and foremost, like sickness and illness and death. How many of you have ever been sick before? Raise your hand up for me. Some of you are not raising your hands, which is impressive. I need to talk to you. If you didn't raise your hand, let me know what your secret is. I would love to know. But if how many of you have gotten food poisoning before? Has anyone experienced that? I feel like Karina has told me that she's concerned about the amount of times that I've gotten food poisoning in my life. And I don't know if that's my fault. I don't feel like it is when I go to like a restaurant and then I'm throwing up afterwards. I don't feel like that's my fault, but I've had it a number of times. I would not recommend ordering beefy cheese burritos from anywhere because beefy is not an ingredient that you should be ordering. That one didn't go over well. I was throwing up for days, and I was laying on the ground thinking, God, if you took me now, I would be okay. Like, I would be okay. Like, if this is the end for me, I wouldn't be terribly disappointed in that, because you're laying here and you're thinking, man, am I, like, this is horrible pain that I'm going through, and I felt like that's just like a hard season to walk through. That's like, nothing compared to the illness and sickness and hardship that some of us have experienced in family members or maybe even in your own life. There are hard things that we go through, and sickness and illness can be the valley of the shadow of death for us, sometimes even very close to death. And you've experienced that in a family member or in your own life. We walk through these things, and it's hard. Another thing that might come up in your life is like opposition of like the ideologies that you hold to. So maybe you would say, like, here are my religious beliefs or here are my political beliefs, but you, maybe if you go to a public school, are the only person who would say you're a Christian in your sphere of influence, or maybe you hold certain viewpoints that are not popular, and people might look down on you or cause you to feel isolated as a result of the things that you hold true and dear to yourself. Walking through seasons where you're either being ostracized or pushed to the side can be really hard to walk through, but Jesus calls us to these things. Maybe you've experienced some sort of mental illness, or you will in the future, depression and anxiety, finding the motivation to wake up every day or the motivation to keep going when the pathway ahead seems so bleak. It can be really hard. Some of you have walked through relationships that have not ended in staying together. If you've ever experienced a breakup, I have a handful of times in my life, and I would say those are some of the hardest times for me to cope with on the other end of. It's like this thing that was so good and so beautiful at first is now something that caused so much pain and grief in life, and it's hard to work through. There's divorce, there's war, there's mass shootings in schools. There's so many things that we could potentially walk through in this life that you could look at and say, this is like a valley that I have to walk through. But what I want you to see, and what we'll see in this verse too as we continue on, is that I want you to distinguish between things happening that are just hard in this life and things happening that God is leading you through. There's certain things where, like, you might say, well, I made a mistake and I'm suffering the consequences of that, or I've wandered off and I need to come back to God. But in this circumstance, this valley that we're walking through is a direct result of us walking a pathway with God in our lives. We think sometimes give too much credit to the work of Satan and the enemy in our lives, trying to tear us down and harm us, or our own failures, when really God is the one just actually leading us through a hard season. And I think we should be careful of that. We should ask the question, okay, where is God in this circumstance that I'm going through right now? Nothing on the list that I gave you just a minute ago are things that you're not going to experience if you become a Christian. And I feel like I thought this when I first, maybe not first, but for a long time as a Christian, I thought I should try and pitch this idea to people like, hey, you should come to Jesus because there's a lot of benefit and Jesus gives you this freedom from all of the hardship that you're going to face in life. But the reality is that Jesus promises that we're going to walk through suffering and persecution and trials and hardships in this life. I thought maybe people would want to come to Jesus more if they thought that it was like all sunshine and rainbows, but that's just not a reality. And sometimes we suffer more as Christians after we become a Christian than we did before, because now all of a sudden we hold this viewpoint that the world hates. And so people are like, why do you love this Jesus guy? He's hateful, he's bigoted, and you'll get pushed away. And I think we need to be careful of that. If we're following Jesus, it doesn't mean that it's going to be sunshine and rainbows. If we're following Jesus, sometimes it means we're going to be walking through the valley of the shadow of death. But here's the thing. It's all great, but it's kind of a depressing message so far. And I don't want you to sit in that. I don't want you to think, wow, is this what my future looks like? And yes, it might be true, but that's not the point of this verse, because it does continue on, and you can throw that up on the screen. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's the next line. For you are with me. He's talking about his shepherd. You are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The sheep don't have to fear anything because of two things. One, the presence of the shepherd is with them at all times during this scenario. They're walking through this valley, but there's literally nothing to fear. And the presence of the shepherd is there, and he has two things. He has his rod and he has his staff, his tools. The shepherd's presence is the most comforting thing for the sheep, because literally nothing can happen to them if the shepherd is with them. And then on top of that, here's from a commentary again. His rod and his staff mean this. So his rod is like a long club or like a short mace or something that the shepherd wore on a cord tied to his belt, a weapon that was close at hand that he could use to injure or hurt or take down any enemies or wild animals that might come against the sheep. And then he said his staff is a long walking stick. You guys know what a shepherd's staff is. He defends us and he walks with us down the roughest of roads. The shepherd's using these tools to protect his sheep. The author of this psalm, his name is David. He is one of the most famous people that we see written about in the Bible. David himself was a shepherd, and so David is looking at his past and his life, and he's saying, these are the things that I did for my sheep, and he's pointing us to Jesus and God, and he's saying, look, this is what God does for us as his sheep. David would fight, he literally says, he fought off lions and bears and these crazy wild animals. How many of you have fought off a lion? Raise your hand. Yeah, so awesome. None of you have, because that's terrifying. But David is like, I need to protect my sheep. This is my livelihood, and if I don't protect them, then I don't have anything to live for anymore, because this is my work in life. So he had to defend his sheep against these things, and that's what a shepherd is able to do. So think back. So we're looking at the elephant. Oh, that's a nice picture. Think back to the elephant graveyard that we had here. So we ended, Simba's sitting, he's backed into a corner with Nala, his friend, and there's 3 hyenas that are literally seconds away from eating him, right? They're seconds away from eating him. He's trapped in the elephant graveyard, and he tries, it's really sad, he tries to growl at them. He's too small, and so it kind of comes out of this as this like sort of gravelly meow, like a little lion cub would. And he tries, and he can't growl, and he can't terrify them because he's just too small and he's too weak on his own. He can't do it. And then on one of the opportunities where he tries, you hear this roar from off camera, and you think, oh man, something bigger is all of a sudden on the scene. And then, lo and behold, a huge lion, his father Mufasa, jumps in, and he grabs the hyenas with his paws. It's huge. He sweeps them up, he throws them on the ground, and he gets his face real close to them. And he says this. He says, if you ever touch my son again. And he doesn't finish that sentence because the implication is that he's like, I'm going to do to you what you are about to do to my son. I will tear you apart. I will destroy you. And the hyenas are terrified because they realize, like, all of a sudden the tables are turned. Mufasa kind of swipes them away, and they scurry off into the shadows. The point of this is that once Mufasa shows up, there's literally nothing to fear. Simba would have been safe the whole time, and he was safe his entire life. He lived in a land of peace where the king, Mufasa, was ruling with grace and was leading Simba in a pathway that would have been safe for him his entire life. There was no need for him to wander off into this graveyard, but once he was no longer safe. And then once he was again in the presence of Mufasa, he was safe again. There's nothing to be afraid of. I think it's a good image of what happens here in this verse. When we're walking with our shepherd, when we ourselves are walking with God, there's nothing for us to fear, literally nothing. Because God is the most powerful person in this story. He's the most powerful thing in the entire universe. So just like the presence of the shepherd is there to protect his sheep, just like Mufasa is there to protect his son, God is here to protect us. And when we are in his presence, we are safe. And that's the good news. And you might be asking, well, like, what about the hardship I face in life? Isn't that like an issue that I have to deal with? Because there's still going to be hard things, so like, shouldn't I be afraid? Or isn't there actual legitimate stuff for me to fear? And also, I could die, Austin. I might die at any point. And that is true. But here, let me explain it this way also. One of the hardest things that I ever had to face in my own life was I was in high school. You guys might laugh because I've told you this story like 100 times. Not a swimming story, ironically. But I was here, I was playing Capture the Flag, and I was running down a hallway, and I broke my face. How many of you have heard this before? At least 7 of you. So I was running down, I was sprinting, broke my face, and I was in a ton of pain, back hallway. I fell down. If you've ever collided into somebody before in like any part of your body, it's painful and it hurts, and I think like, okay, the pain will subside, I'll be okay. But the thing that really concerned me was my friends took one look at me and said, oh, we better call his parents. And that's like not the thing you want to hear when you're on the ground in a lot of pain. And I thought, why do they need to call my parents? I just got hit, it's just a bruise, like maybe just get me some ice. They walked me over to the cafe area, and they helped me out, and my immediate concern was first of all, the pain did not go away. It was just as painful when I got hit as it was for like the next 3 hours, which is horrible pain. But the thing that was most concerning was I couldn't see out of the left side of I couldn't see out of my left eye. And I was terrified. I thought, like, I don't know what just happened, but I think I got hit pretty hard. My friends are concerned. I'm going to the ER right now, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to see out of my left eye ever again. For all I knew, my eye was like gone. And the people at the ER didn't really help, because when I got to the ER, they're like, hey, let's just take some x-rays. And they look at the x-rays and they're like, oh, we need to get you scheduled for surgery like ASAP. We need to wait for the swelling to go down. It's going to take a couple days, but we need to get you into the hospital, and this needs to be taken care of. And as I walked through that season, this Psalm 23, was a constant encouragement to me, because it's kind of this moment where I was like, I literally don't know what is going to happen. Will I be able to see out of my left eye? I don't know. My parents are freaking out. But no matter what happens, I don't have to be afraid of anything, because I know God is with me throughout this whole circumstance, and he's here to comfort me and to walk me through this hard season. Ultimately, what I do want to communicate to you is that I do have vision in my left eye. I'm not half blind. And I would say after 2 reconstructive surgeries and 18 months of braces that I didn't want to have, the doctors were able to fix everything almost miraculously, like fully recovered. And I found out then that I was colorblind, because I got eye testing, which was a new thing to me, but then it explained a lot of arguments I had as a child. But what I want you to hear tonight is this, that I don't know whatever you're walking through. Each of us walk through hard seasons in life, but the good news is that God does not leave us alone in our suffering, and he didn't leave us alone in our suffering is what I really mean to say, because what we get to look back on is 2,000 years ago, God himself came down to earth in the form of Jesus. He was beaten, he was crucified, he died, he was buried into the ground. He went through a terrible, horrible, season of suffering. And he did it partly so that he could walk through this thing that we also walk through, which is all of the hardships and things that we face in this life. Our God is not just sitting up in heaven watching us and saying, man, that's a bummer that you have to go through all that hard stuff. He walked through it himself. He knows what we've gone through. He can sympathize and empathize, and he understands what we've gone through and what we're going to go through. So whatever you're going through tonight, no matter what the circumstances are, I would hope that you look to this psalm and see it as a comfort and know that God is with you, not just like he's up there with you, but he has also sent his Spirit to walk through life with you. He has given us each his Holy Spirit, if we choose to accept it, to walk with us and be with us through every single season, every single hardship that we face. And I want you to remember these things tonight. I want you to remember that whatever hardship you might be facing now or whatever hardship you might be facing in the future, you don't have to walk through it alone because the Lord, who is your shepherd, is with you. And I want you to ask yourself this tonight. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Because there are a lot of terrifying things in this world, or maybe you would say like in the valley of the shadow of death, there's a lot of terrifying things. But God commands us to fear no one but him alone. Just like if we look back to Mufasa, the most terrifying person in that story is Mufasa, for Simba and for the hyenas. So Simba can be afraid of the hyenas, but ultimately he should be more afraid of his dad, because his dad is the most powerful thing in the room, right? So when we look at our own lives, what are we afraid of? What are you afraid of? Because God is so much more powerful than anything that you could be anxious or fearful of. And we need to turn our attention back to him to worship him as a result. And finally this, remember tonight that the valley of the shadow of death is no joke. It's not a joke. It's not just like this trivial thing that we face through life. It is a hard season. There are hard seasons that you will face. But again, remember this one thing. Remember this one thing. It's always better to be with God in the valley than to be anywhere else without him. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this psalm and these promises that you've given us in this psalm. I pray that you help us remember whenever we walk through hard seasons that you have promised to be with us, and all we have to do is to let you guide us throughout our lives. I pray that you continue to help us learn this lesson and also just recognize that there are hard seasons ahead of us and be okay with that, knowing that this life is not just an easy walk in the park, but God, if we're with you, that we're safe with you, I pray that you help us understand that and see how real that is as we walk through life and all of the hard things that we do need to walk through in our future. I pray that you give comfort to us tonight, and especially to anyone who is hurting or who is going through a hard season. Be with them now, and bless us as we go into our small group time to discuss some of these things. God, we praise you and we thank you. We pray these things in your name. Amen.